think it's recording. In a little bit. Oh, okay. That's fine.
Hey.
Hi, Christopher.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Okay. Just it's cocktail time.
It's cocktail time. Oh, lovely. So I'm Jen Scholler.
I'm Beth. We're part of the Louisville Library book, and we know David Burns, who I guess correspond with on Twitter.
Okay, you're breaking up a little bit. Hold on one second. I want to make sure. If I cut you off, call me right back. I want to make sure I don't have anything playing in the background.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have like 10 apps running. Okay. I think this will work better now.
All right. Perfect.
Okay, good. Oh, and now I get to see both of you at the same time.
Perfect.
Oh, that's fun.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
And you get to see.
That's
Right.
Yeah, that's
amazing.
That is an amazing view, huh?
And
I thought it would be sort of atmospheric. Yeah.
It is.
We're having snow today, so it looks like you're having decent weather there.
No, actually, it's cloudy and crummy today.
Oh,
But
no.
we had several days of beautiful weather.
Oh.
You're getting hit by this like massive cold front, right?
We are, yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, let's shoot. Let's talk about the book,
Yeah, all
or
right.
whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
no.
Probably the
That's
book.
what we.
Definitely. Well, thanks so much for taking some time to talk
Right.
to
We
us.
really appreciate this.
Sure, it's my pleasure.
All right. So, I mean, we do, like I mentioned in my email, we generally like to get a little bit of kind of biography, background. So if you want to do a little bit of an introduction, I'm sure everyone would be interested in that.
Well, okay. Let's see. My name is Christopher Dickey, and I've written 7 books, and they're literally all over the map. Central America, the Middle East, fiction, nonfiction, memoir.
Mm-hmm.
Memoirs about my father, who was a pretty well-known poet and novelist, especially back in the 60s and 70s. Most famous for Deliverance, the movie, which was made into a movie,
Mm-hmm.
which terrified generations of people.
Right. Still does.
And I normally write about current events, particularly about terrorism and espionage.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also, I should say, I'm the world news editor for the Daily Beast, based here in Paris, and also a contributor to NBC and MSNBC.
All right.
And if you see me occasionally, the NBC studio is right above my head. So if you see me occasionally on TV, it'll have the Arc de Triomphe in back of me, but from a higher angle. So,
Great.
So anyway, that's sort of the basics. And I have 2 siblings. My brother's a radiologist, and my baby sister, half-sister, is also an author. She wrote a fabulous book called Pit Bull that is a sort of a sociological study of the pit bull dogs in the history of the United States.
Okay,
And
interesting.
And I'm sure you would all find that very interesting too.
Yes.
We'll have to keep that in mind. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's a fascinating story about how you found Robert Bunch and decided to do your research on him.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me think about it. So, no, kidding. So the as I said, my main interest for a long time has been terrorism in the Middle East, and gosh, it must have been. It was on my 40th birthday, so 27 years ago. I was taking a break, finally, and I was in the Seychelles with my wife, and I brought along a lot of reading material, and I quit smoking on my 40th birthday.
Wow.
And I didn't want to do anything. So I just lay in a hammock in the Seychelles and read And the book that I was reading mainly was a biography of Sir Richard Francis Burton, who was a great Arabian explorer. He had gone to Mecca in disguise, and he was this really romantic, interesting figure. There was a kind of an okay movie made about part of his life called Mountains of the Moon. I don't know if you ever saw that. And Fawn Brodie wrote a great biography of him. There have been several great biographies of him. He's the perfect subject for a biographer because he did all these amazing things, but he's a terrible writer himself. Nobody can read his book.
Oh.
So if you're a biographer and you can read his books, you've got a huge amount of material to draw on. And in all the biographies, there is one tremendous lacuna, which is this man who's really got a well-documented life. His life has fallen apart. He's come back searching for the sources of the Nile after great suffering, and the man who was there with him, William Hanning Speke, has betrayed him and claims to have found himself the sources of the Nile. And Burton doesn't feel that that's confirmed, but can't disprove it. Meanwhile, the woman that he's been involved with, that he thought he was going to marry, or at least she thought she was going to marry him, that's all been broken off by her parents. And his best friend says, you know, I'm going to go to America. Why don't you come with me? They have cocktails in America. Let's drink our way through America. Let's have gin fizzes and rum punches and all these great things they have in America. And he's like, well, that sounds like an idea. And that's the anecdote that his trip hinges on. In fact, they didn't leave for several more months, and he did things like learn how to make a Bowie knife as a blacksmith, and he did all this kind of stuff. And his goal apparently was to go out and interview Brigham Young and write about the Mormons, which he eventually did. But he lands in the United States in the late spring of 1860, and he lands in Newfoundland, actually, goes down to Boston, he goes to New York, he goes to Washington, D.C., and then he disappears. And we don't know what he did for about 2 months. And he resurfaces, saying that he's been in New Orleans, but he resurfaces in St. Joe, Missouri, headed west. So we know that he traveled through the South, but we don't know what he did. We don't have any, and nobody knows what he did. And so I thought, what a great mystery, and also a great sort of hole in the historical record that you could write a novel about.
Oh, right. Okay. Oh, right.
So I started researching that, thinking that would be a novel. And the more I researched it, the more I realized I really didn't like Richard Francis Burton very much.
Oh.
And, you can write about a cad. My next book is about a cad. But Burton also was terribly racist and anti-Semitic and all kinds of things. Once you get into his history, it gets more and more unpleasant. And I thought, okay. But I'd done all this research, and as I continued to do the research, I was at Kew, the British National Archives at Kew, and I thought that I would dig up the consular records for all the consuls that he might have visited if he was touring the South, to see if there was any record of them meeting him or at least what they were doing. And I started reading the consular dispatches of Robert Bunch, the consul in Charleston. And I thought, these are really interesting and very detailed. And then I started doing research about the consuls, the British consuls. And there were 2 or 3 monographs written about them. And the ones that were written about Bunch were completely at variance with his confidential correspondence. They said basically that he was sympathetic to the South. And you read his confidential correspondence, it's absolutely clear he's not sympathetic to the South. The other thing I discovered was this whole business of the fight against the slave trade. And the biggest single staff, if you could call it that, in the Foreign Office, or the Foreign and Colonial Office, as it was called then, the biggest part of it was fighting the slave trade. And all the consuls who were in any way connected with any place that might be involved in the slave trade or was involved in the slave trade, all of them reported voluminously on it. So when you pull the files, the queue, there are one set of books, there's regular consular traffic and political traffic, and there's another set of books that's entirely devoted to the slave trade and stopping the slave trade. So I thought, well, this is really interesting, and I never read about any of this. This is like, there's like two little really thin monographs that touch on that aspect of things. And most of the things that you'll read about the slave trade go back to the 18th century, the early 19th century, or they talk about Cuba and Brazil. Okay, fine. But they don't really look closely at the slave trade and the effort to reopen the slave trade that existed in the middle of the 19th century.
Right.
And of course, as I read through Bunch's confidential dispatches, he's writing about, starting in about 1857, he's writing about that all the time, saying they are going to secede, they are going to reopen the slave trade, and eventually also Lord Lyons, the minister in Washington, would back him up, saying it doesn't matter what the South claims, even in the Confederate Constitution, about abolishing the slave trade. That's not going to happen. Once they get independence, especially since it's going to be a loose confederation, these states will do what they want.
Right.
And because there was a bubble market in human beings, there was every economic incentive to go to Africa and buy slaves for $100 a head that you could sell for $1,000 a head. Which meant that the economics of the slave trade in that period, they were always like this, but particularly in that period, were such that you could lose a third of your cargo easily and throw them overboard and still make a huge profit.
Right.
Which is exactly what happened with one of the last slave ships that was known, the famous Wanderer, that landed in Georgia in 1859. But it was also true of the Clotilda, which I wrote about, which landed in Mobile, near Mobile, in 1860. So all of that, I just found all of that fascinating. And I realized that Robert Bunch was the guy who could pull it all together for me. And because he had led this double life where the biggest slave owner, or certainly one of the biggest slave owners in the Carolinas, had married his sister-in-law and was naming their children after Robert Bunch, I thought, well, wait a minute, did that brother-in-law did he ever read any of those dispatches? And of course the answer is no. If he had, he would have been angry, and if a lot of people in Charleston had known about those dispatches, there would have been a lot of physical danger for the Bunch.
Right.
So
That's all
there you go.
It is. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Right. So you're, it sounds like some of your research, you had to go to a castle to find some of the correspondence from Lyons, and that's
absolutely
really interesting.
But from Lyons, and a lot of it relating directly to Bunch. I had talked to Amanda Foreman. I don't know if you know her book, Setting the World on Fire, I think it was called a huge book, terrific book about the British diplomats and press during the Civil War, mainly about the press during the Civil War. And there's some overlap in my book. And so I looked up Amanda and I lunched with her one day and I said, there's this one gap in my research. Do you happen to have the records from down there in West Sussex at Arundel? And she said, well, maybe I'll try and look it up. I don't think she did have that research. It was really voluminous. But I kept putting it off. And then we were actually in the first draft of the book had been done. And I thought it was pretty good. And the editor thought it was pretty good. But he said, we really could use more details about Lyons and his relationship with Bunch. And so I'd been to there was a library in West Sussex. But all the papers finally had been moved out of that library and back to the collection of the Duke of Norfolk in Arundel Castle. If you ever saw Young Victoria, the movie, Young Victoria, Arundel Castle doubles for Windsor Castle in that movie.
Okay. Yeah.
And it is an incredible castle. If you ever go to England, you should go down to West Sussex. It's an easy ride on a commuter train.
Okay.
And Arundel Castle is just like everything you ever wanted in a castle, right? So I went and got a little room in a little hotel there and arranged to see them on the one day they're not open to tourists. So I go and I went, honestly, I went to the front door of the castle, the big gates, which were closed. I rang the bell, the gates swing open. I go in, there's a guy waiting for me with a golf cart. We get in the golf cart, we go tooling through the grounds of Arundel Castle. We go over, I kid you not, the drawbridge. We check in with security. We walk through the Great Hall with, armor, suits of armor on all sides and shields and stuff. At the end of it, a spiral staircase, and up the spiral staircase, and there in the tower, called the Library Tower of Arundel Castle, that's where the staff, very small staff, 2 people, run those archives. Okay. And they have the archives down in some kind of storeroom, which I didn't see. But you tell them what you want, box such and such, and they will bring it up. And so they did, and they laid out some green beige on some card tables in a room that had posters from young Victoria all over the place. And I was looking out through leaded windows at the towers of the castle and photographing hundreds and hundreds of pages of Lyon's copybooks and original correspondence.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was the mother lode. It made all the pieces fit in place.
Oh, okay, great.
Brought it together.
So, but that was really, that was quite.
not a bad environment to have to do your research in.
Yeah, quite an adventure.
No, it was a very special environment, and there were a couple of good pubs where I could take the staff of the library.
Nice.
It was very pleasant.
Oh, good. Go ahead. So kind of related to the research, I had a question. I know you've talked about reading kind of the consular dispatches and how very different they were from kind of the monographs of Bunch, where they thought that he was very kind of pro-Confederacy. In terms of firsthand accounts of Bunch's relationship with the people of Charleston, was it difficult to find things like that, or were they available?
Well, there were lots of little bits and pieces. There was, for one thing, the press was very active in Charleston. Oh. So the Charleston Mercury didn't have a huge circulation directly, but it was picked up all the time by the northern papers, partly because it was so outrageous. Okay. Oh. It's sort of like liberal papers covering the Tea Party movement.
Sure.
And so it was constantly being quoted. But also in the Charleston Library Society, where I spent a considerable amount of time, they have microfilmed and original copies of the newspapers from that period. Oh, wow. So, there was a lot of leafing through dusty newspapers to see what they wrote about Bunch. And every so often you'd come across sometimes things that were quite detailed, but other times just little snippets, like the record of him, and I think it was supposed to be his sister who arrived with him. Actually, it was his newlywed wife. Oh. When they arrived in Charleston in 1853. But also, in addition to all that, in the consular correspondence, if Bunch was mentioned or issues of direct concern were mentioned, he often would cut out those clippings from the local papers or whatever papers came across his desk and include those in his consular correspondence. Oh, okay. So you would have those too. And then several people kept diaries, although not in great detail. The most famous diary out of Charleston is Mary Chestnut's diary, originally published as Diary from Dickey, although there are now much more complete and better annotated collections of her diary entries. And she mentioned Bunch a few times and Mrs. Bunch a few times. But in these kind of oblique ways where you have to really sort of figure out exactly what's going on to figure out what she's referring to. You know, why is Mrs. Bunch not being allowed to see Charleston society women anymore at a certain point late in their tour? Things like that.
Okay.
So, and then of course you just have Bunch's own correspondence where he talks a lot about the people he's talking to, and also very useful to me in that book and in this book is the really very detailed my diary North and South by excuse me a second William Howard Russell, who was the great London Times correspondent, war correspondent of the day, and who visited the North and the South in 1861 and spent a couple of days in Charleston with Bunch. And it's clear that Bunch had a considerable influence on Russell's opinions.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Did you get a feeling for Bunch as a person? I mean, for his personality?
Yeah, I think I did.
I
think I did. He was not an ideologue at all. He was appalled by slavery when he saw it, but I don't think he went to the South with any kind of abolitionist sentiment. I think that he was a climber. He thought that the specific question of addressing the Negro Seaman's Law, which was prejudicial to British interests, that was going to help him build his career. Because if you were a consular officer, it was not at all the same as being a full-fledged diplomat.
Right.
And he wanted to make that transition in the worst way. But he also had a lot of special interests and a very special background. Even consular officers often were unpaid or had minimal payment, and they were pursuing business interests. There were lots of conflicts of interest. Molyneux, for instance, in Savannah, the consul in Savannah, was not only a slave owner, but in the local market, a slave trader. So, you know, he was unacceptable. There were only actually 2, maybe 3 fully staff paid consuls among the, I think, 11 or 12 British consuls in America, and Bunch was one of them. The other one was in New York, and the one I'm sort of raising my eyebrow about is the one in New Orleans, who was quite a good consul. But most of the others were not all that good, and they had lots of conflicts of interest. But Bunch went at the job as a professional diplomat because he wanted to be a professional diplomat. But the other thing about Bunch that was so unusual is that he had spent a lot of time growing up in Latin America. His father was an Englishman from the Bahamas who had been essentially a gun runner, a financier of Simón Bolívar in his revolutions in South America. And so Bolívar had settled on him a rather large finca, farm, estate outside of Bogotá. And a lot of the family's wealth was tied up in that. And so one of Bunch's ambitions was eventually to get back to Bogotá to oversee his family's fortune. And if he could do that as a diplomat, well, so much the better.
Right. Okay.
So he was always angling for that. Even when he was very early in his career in Charleston, he was writing letters about, well, I think I've done what I can do here. How about if I go to Bogotá? Well, no.
Yeah, that kind of, you know, through this whole process that he was really working to be, you know, act as a diplomat and, you know, seemingly doing a pretty good job of it and convincing everyone really that he was, you know, not such an abolitionist or not, you know, trying to interfere as much, I guess, with the South to the point where they thought he was kind of sympathetic to them. That kind of ended up causing a bit of his downfall for a while, but he did eventually make it to Bogotá.
He did. Eventually, I mean, look, the thing about Bunch is that he was not an abolitionist. He hated slavery, and when he saw what slavery looked like firsthand, he was disgusted by it. But he was like a lot of professional diplomats that you see even today. Look at how many have tried to find some accommodation with the rather erratic policies of the United States right now. You know, they're just trying to do their best and within a framework that they understand. And Bunch had understood, when he understood, as really no other officials were clear about, that the goal of the South was to of the firebrands in the South was to reopen the slave trade with Africa. He had to inform the Crown of this, and he had to keep reminding them of this because, of course, Palmerston and the others, while they hated slavery, liked that cotton. And they didn't like the American Republic, remember. So they were looking for any excuse to back the South. And that's why this little piece of information is so important, because the South clearly thought that London would back them right from the get-go. And that didn't happen. And it was not going to happen after January 1863 and the Emancipation Proclamation. But in between, from April 1861 until Fort Sumter, until, basically October, November of 1862, but really January of 1863, which was the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect. There was a huge doubt in Europe about what the Civil War was all about. Because Lincoln and Seward kept saying it's not about freeing the slaves. I mean, they were explicit about that. Why were they explicit about that? Because, among other things, they didn't want to lose Maryland. Because they lose Maryland, which is a slave state, they lose Washington. This leaves the Europeans sort of deeply confused. And when you're confused like that, then you look to your own interests. And the interest of the Europeans was to get cotton. So if you're not fighting to free the slaves, why should we care what your war is about? And that is where Bunch's information and insistence on the slave trade became so important. Because that was the thing that came again and again and again when Palmerston's government was on the edge, right on the brink of recognizing the South. The question came up, what about the slave trade? And the answer was always the wrong answer. And Bunch and Lyons had framed their dispatches in a way that there couldn't be a right answer. If the South said, well, we've got to import slaves because they're so damn expensive and we really need them, there was a disastrous answer, and sometimes that was the answer. Or if the South said, well, no, we're going to ban slave trading with anybody who's not part of the South, that was the wrong answer too, because the Lyons had been sending dispatches based on Bunch's reporting saying that was just a lie, that was all bullshit. That they were, so for that year and some months, when England couldn't make up its mind what to do, that was a key element that kept them from supporting the South. And then after 1863, they were not going to support the South at all. And that is the history of the Civil War. Without that support, the South couldn't win the war, even as screwed up as the Union Army was. Eventually, the weight of the Union Army was going to be brought to bear.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me that that Bunch was able to be astute enough to kind of make that connection fairly early on, and understand that was kind of the key piece of information to keep passing along.
Yeah, and Lyons and he convinced Lyons of that, and then Lyons took up the banner and continued to push that line. It was always the wrong answer. It's just amazing. When I was doing the research, it was just amazing. Everybody's looking out there, what's going on? Oh, police. Lots of police. There must be the yellow vests behind me somewhere.
Oh, okay. Yes.
We'll add a little drama here.
Okay. A little excitement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there you go. All these people staring out the window.
All right. Well, that's great. I mean, there's so much to talk about in this book. I'm sure we'll have a great discussion on the 11th, and it'll be really great to have this discussion as well.
Well, let me just make one more point that I think has to be understood. Probably in Colorado, this is not a big issue, but I can tell you as a Southerner, this comes up all the time. You hear the Civil War was not about slavery.
Right. It was about states' rights.
Yeah. Well, it was about the states' rights to own slaves.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's what it was about. Mm-hmm. But while I was working on the book, and particularly once the book came out and I was talking about it, I realized you can reduce the cause of the Civil War to fewer than 280 characters, actually fewer than 140 characters. You can tweet it. The South seceded to defend slavery, and the North went to war to stop secession.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
That is from 1861 to 1863. That's the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
Politically.
Right.
After that, it's another story, because then it became a crusade more and more to free the slaves.
And it's still going on.
And it is still going on.
Right.
And I think about it all the time. And frankly, if you read into the literature of the radical secessionists in the South, and you can sort of blot out the word slavery, the discourse is almost exactly the same as what you hear from the Tea Party in the United States and the far right of the Republican Party. It's so similar. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely disturbing. Mm-hmm. And when you know all that, and then you hear, I don't want to sound terribly partisan, but things are just so crazy. And then you hear people talk about the Republican Party of today as the party of Lincoln. You think that has nothing to do with reality.
Right.
Right.
It's ever since the Southern strategy of Richard Nixon.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right. Okay.
You've basically had a Republican Party where at least one wing of it passionately embraced the heritage of the slave owners and Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. And that hadn't changed.
No, I think we see it again and again. I mean,
It's gotten worse. Today. But maybe you can cut this part of the interview in case it's too politically volatile.
No,
we don't really shy away from that too much.
No, I think I think our group is fairly uniform in agreement with that.
Well, I hope everybody liked the book, and I'm working on another book.
What is your current book?
The new book the working title is Our Man in Paris.
Oh.
And it's actually not about a British diplomat. It's about the various American diplomats and covert operatives who were active during the Civil War here in France.
Oh, that would be fascinating.
And
that sounds great.
And the central figure is a sort of a roué, a cad, who has been described as the first renegade CIA agent 100 years before there was a CIA.
Wow, okay.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating.
So that's what and who, by the way, courted the half-sister of Robert Bunch in Bogota. Small world back then.
Small world, huh?
Right. And did Robert Bunch's family go with him when he went to South America?
When he went to South America, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was interested in that.
Yeah. I think his daughter may have gone away to school, but I'm pretty sure his wife Emma went with him. Yeah.
And do you have an expected publication date for your current work?
Well, Not really. We're still working on that, but I just turned in 130 pages yesterday.
Okay.
So I feel like we're moving ahead.
Definitely.
Yeah,
All right. Great. Well, I look forward to that.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Me too.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed your writing so much.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thanks so much.
Goodbye. I and the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest, say goodbye to you.
All right.
Okay. Well,
Have a
thank
good
you so
evening.
much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.